Today we're talking about something that I feel like is everywhere right now, wellness culture. And the big question we're asking is this a direct response to the pandemic? Did COVID basically turbocharge this whole thing? Or was wellness already becoming this enormous cultural force and COVID just accelerated it? Let's get into all of that and more.
Welcome to the Gen XZ Exchange. I'm Chris Perkins, Gen X parent, now 50-something empty nester.
And I'm Lily Perkins, Gen Z career explorer. We swap insights on career choices, work, and life in general.
So whether you're a Gen X parent trying to figure out midlife's challenges,
or a Gen Z young professional or student figuring out adulthood, you're in the right place. Okay, so I want to start off this episode with something basic because I think people use wellness to mean really different things nowadays. Dad, when you hear wellness culture, what comes to mind? What does it mean to you?
the first thing that comes to mind is retreats. I think of wellness culture as being different to fitness and health.
Mm.
So it's meditation, breathing exercises, walking barefoot on the grass, all of that kind of stuff. I think as different to health and fitness. What comes to mind for you?
I think it seems to be an ever-changing kind of concept and it exists on a bit of a spectrum. So you see a lot online about the more extreme end of things where you've got, the green juices, the 5 a.m. runs, but also the culture I grew up with, like you've talked about there, with mindfulness, apps, therapy being normalised, talking about mental health openly. And that was just a part of my teenage years, which I think is pretty fortunate. And I even had a mindfulness class in school at one point.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
So that was good. Just a little period. I think it was like a lunchtime club or maybe it was like a period a week or something. But that was set up by one of my lovely maths teachers.
Right, which is a really significant shift because when I was at school, therapy certainly wasn't as mainstream as it is now. It was only really something if you were seriously ill. And obviously the whole mental health conversation has really only come to the fore probably with your generation primarily, or maybe the millennials to a certain extent, but it wasn't really a thing when I was in my teenage years and as a young adult.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about a lot more later on. But before we go any further, it's worth just putting some numbers out there about how big this actually is. We like some stats on here. So the global wellness industry, and this is across everything, fitness, mental health, nutrition, sleep technology, spa and beauty, was valued at around $5.6 trillion in 2022.
Wow.
And projections have it hitting close to $8.5 trillion by 2027.
Next year, 8.5 trillion. But I guess if you're including fitness, beauty, spa, industry stuff, that's huge. Wow. So wellness culture isn't just one thing anymore. It's huge. It sounds like it's this kind of umbrella term. So physical wellness, mental wellness, spiritual wellness, financial wellness, social wellness, wellness in everything.
Wellness,
basically a lens for looking at your entire life by the sounds of it and making an improvement wherever you can. I'd argue that expansion of what wellness covers is relatively new. Because when I was in my 20s, wellness, I'm not even sure was a thing. I mean, fitness certainly was. It meant going to the gym, maybe taking vitamins or supplements. I think the psychological
or yoga retreats and things.
Yeah, the psychological and emotional dimension weren't really part of the mainstream conversation.
Yeah. So then let's talk about where all of this started shifting, because I think that's important before we get into the effects of COVID. So I put a real turning point around the mid-2010s. So, social media starts connecting wellness content to a mass audience. And around that time, I was just coming onto social media and I remember already being bombarded with fitness content. You would see these healthy, quote-unquote, versions of dessert recipes, which, let's be real, were minging. All these home workouts that you could do. What do you remember from that kind of time? Is that when you maybe saw the spikes in the whole yoga retreat, wellness retreat thing?
So pre-COVID, I guess I've never really been a big social media user. I wasn't at that time, but I think certainly health and fitness was more prominent. Probably at the time I started doing triathlons when I was 39, triathlon was like the new marathon. So people have been doing marathons sort of since the 70s. And then it was all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, I can remember grandma doing yoga in the 70s, but yoga became much more mainstream. And it probably was social media that played a big role in that, making it more accessible, maybe making it more aspirational. Pilates, all of that kind of stuff. I don't remember that growing up. So all these different forms of health, fitness, well-being, Reiki, acupuncture, smoothies. Yeah, I guess all of that's coming in, certainly from post-millennium and I guess into the 2010s.
And it was all very aestheticized. It was about how good that you looked doing your yoga and making your smoothies and how nice your smoothies looked and all the rest of it. And then even if you think about the introduction of like your Garmin and Apple Watch and Fitbit devices, all that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then on the Gen Z side, I'd say the mental health conversation really started entering the mainstream culture for us, like 2015, 2016, maybe I remember. That's when I think the conversation started happening in schools too, which was good.
Yeah.
And that maps onto the rise of smartphones and social media, which is when we saw increasing rates of anxiety and depression in young people. So by the time COVID hit, we were already in a world that was at least starting to talk about mental health as being a part of wellness.
Yeah.
And then that leads us into the COVID effect. So going back in time to March 2020, the world locks down. How was that experience for you, Dad? Because like so many people out there, we obviously had a bit of a rubbish time in 2020. I want to know how all of that changed, how you were thinking about your own health.
Yeah, I think everyone had a rubbish time from March 2020, but you're right about the downward trend around mental health prior to that. I remember reading Anxiety Generation, Jonathan Haidt's book. I think we talked about that in the social media episode.
Yep.
And he has all these graphs where you can see that downward trend in health and well-being and mental health from kind of 2010, as soon as sort of smartphones and social media arrived. I remember immediately before lockdown, I was still going to work. I was still commuting to London, and Mum was saying, "We're going to lock down." I'm like, "No, we're not. It's just like a flu bug."
Yeah.
Little
did you know.
Well, I actually resigned from my job then, and that date's kind of imprinted on my mind, 6th of March, 2020. Thinking I'm going to start my own business as an employer brand consultant. And then 2 weeks later, we locked down. And that was possibly the worst time in history to think about starting a recruitment related business.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a job. I had lots of time to think. And because I had been doing that long distance commute for 8 years at that point, that first month or two, I realized how exhausted I had been. I had just been like running on fumes for ages, kind of tired and wired. And that was a real wake up call. So I really need to be looking after myself a bit better. And obviously there was all the sort of COVID stuff and the health risks going on at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for Gen Z as well, the pandemic hit at a very specific and inconvenient life stage, because a lot of us were teenagers or in our early 20s.
Exams,
exams, school, uni, whatever. So the crisis for us wasn't as much about physical vulnerability or, I don't think as many of us were as scared of getting ill necessarily, but it was more the fear of being isolated and losing out on formative experiences. Like if you were going into your first year of uni, freshers was off the table. You were worried about having your development as a young person being disrupted. So I think the wellness response for a lot of us was much more psychological and based on the kind of fear of missing out rather than the health side. Obviously that doesn't go for people my age who were maybe dealing with, chronic illness or whatever, but for the vast majority, I think that was the fear.
Yeah.
And the data backs this up. So during the pandemic, downloads of mental health apps increased by 200% globally in 2020.
Wow. It could have been more, actually. I wouldn't have been surprised if it was more. Yeah.
So Calm and Headspace, the mindfulness meditation apps, both reported their biggest ever growth years, but also searches for things like how to build immunity, vitamin D, zinc supplements, that all absolutely skyrocketed.
Yeah, a 2021 survey found that 42% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety or depression, up from about 11% before the pandemic.
Yeah, so this is, where the cultural conversation was really beginning and affecting everyone. and there was a real cultural shift that happened. But what I want to know is whether that shift, that conversation was genuinely helpful for people now, looking back on the pandemic, or whether it's gotten to the point where it's now been so commercialized and it's gotten maybe toxic.
Yeah, I think that could well be the case. If we fast forward to present day, we're seeing the effects of this cultural shift present across the different generations.
Yeah, and as usual, social media hasn't helped anything. So coming back to the present day, if we're talking about Gen Z, I don't know if this was directly caused by the pandemic, but I feel like there's maybe some link somewhere when we think about therapy talk being really normalized. So boundaries, triggers, emotional regulation, nervous system regulation. This is genuinely part of how a lot of my peers talk about themselves. And I think there's a version of Gen Z wellness culture that can become quite internal. Like everything is about your feelings, your traumas, your nervous system, your triggers. And for me, sometimes it feels like that level of self-focus and analysis is almost narcissistic. And like this approach doesn't necessarily make you more functional as a human being. It doesn't improve your health necessarily or make you more connected to other people. Whereas I think the Gen X approach did involve just getting on with things, which has its own value. I don't know how that rings true today. I don't know if that rings true today or not.
Yeah, I think, as our conditioning, just get on with it. We were brought up by the post-war generation, so the whole stiff upper lip thing. I think that's where a lot of the snowflake stuff came from. It was
Definitely.
maybe Gen Xers thinking young people should just pull themselves together. But
Yeah.
I can remember my grandparents talking to me like that when I was a teenager. I slouching around, doing nothing, get a proper job, all of that stuff. But there wasn't the focus on health. I think the other big factor here is around body image, and we know that has been driven by social media. So perhaps the desire to be seen to be exercising, eating a good diet. I mean, it kind of started in the 80s with aerobics, but really, really came into its own, I think, with social media.
Yeah.
So as I said, grandma was doing yoga in the 70s, but it became a big thing sort of late 90s into the 2000s, and it's just accelerated as a result of everything we've seen on the social channels.
Yeah, I think for Gen Z, we can experience the body issues, but then there's the mental health aspect of it as well, where it's like for grandma's generation, for example, body and body image and how you appear to others, kind of everything. And if there's mental health issues going on, there's less of a dialogue around that. And like you say, it's more pushing it down kind of thing. So then if we're looking at more recent years, thinking about Gen Z and mental health, a 2023 survey found that Gen Z is the most likely generation to report having received mental health treatment, with around 37% saying they'd seen a therapist or counsellor, compared to about 22% of boomers. And then Gen X sits somewhere in the middle of those two. So similar to Calm and all the meditation mindfulness apps, BetterHelp, which is an online therapy app, absolutely blew up during COVID. And therapy became something you could access from your bedroom, which in a lot of ways was stigma reducing for different generations. And you had a lot of new people accessing those tools.
Yeah. And I think in some sense, it was really amazing that became available.
Definitely.
At scale at the time when we all needed it, because everyone was going a bit stir crazy in lockdown. Yeah.
It was like an entryway into it without having to actually enter a therapist's office and, deal with that stigma. And then you also have the TikTok and social media as a wellness base. And I find that the self-diagnosis culture on those platforms is quite concerning, especially in recent years. And I think this kind of blew up during COVID too. People diagnosing themselves with ADHD, autism, BPD, complex trauma problems based on all these 30-second videos that they were seeing. And that can go two ways, because, of course, sometimes it leads to someone getting real help, but then sometimes it leads to people my age maybe building an identity around a diagnosis that may or not be accurate or may not be something that they have.
Yeah, I was on a call yesterday actually where someone shared that they had been diagnosed with ADHD, and there was probably like about 8 people on the call. 2 other people then jumped in and was like, oh, I think I've got ADHD. I'm not diagnosed, but I think I've got it too. And it's just because it's better understood. There's more information out there. But
Yeah.
that self-diagnosis thing, could be a bit of a concern.
A lot of the videos you see are literally just signs that you have ADHD, and it's like you don't like doing work, you feel tired, like very generalized assumptions.
Yeah,
So,
and take this online quiz and
yeah.
it will tell you rather than getting a clinical diagnosis. And I think the other thing to factor in is that puts a huge strain on the healthcare system
Yep.
with people that want appointments for diagnosis. And if they get diagnosed, they need the support. And we know the NHS is kind of creaking at the seams. It can't handle these kind of volumes. And I think that the signs that people feel let down by whatever kind of support they got during the pandemic, they want to take matters into their own hands, maybe. So some people are able to access private healthcare, but for
Yeah.
everyone else it's kind of DIY, which is a bit
Yeah.
dangerous.
If all you have access to is the online quiz and you are having doubts about your mental health or conditions that you may have, like, you're going to take the online quiz.
Yeah.
And that leads me into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is, the dark side of wellness and wellness culture. So, starting off with the elephant in the room, money, as we've established, the wellness industry is worth trillions. And actually, a disproportionate amount of that is sold to and consumed by people who are already relatively privileged.
Mm-hmm.
So, the people who need the most support, actually, people living in poverty, people working multiple jobs, people without access to healthcare in some places, they're largely excluded from the wellness conversation.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? The people that need it the most have the least access to it, because almost all of the wellness culture things that you've mentioned are private or commercial enterprises. It's not something that's available on the NHS, or there aren't necessarily these kind of well-being programs provided through local authorities or not-for-profit bodies. I think the thing that is the things that genuinely improve well-being, so stable housing, food security, access to healthcare, safe working conditions, time to rest, those are all kind of systemic. If you look at kind of what's happening in the country at the moment, we're not delivering on a lot of those things.
Nope.
But wellness culture packages well-being as a personal choice, as a consumer product. Buy this and feel better. And the people that really need it aren't in a position to be able to do that. So
yeah,
I don't think we can say like a meditation app is useless. It serves a purpose, and I think a lot of people find them really helpful. But if someone's anxiety is caused by not being able to pay the rent, no amount of mindfulness is going to fix that.
Yeah, you can't, meditate your way out of these issues. And there's actually a term for this called wellness washing. So I'm glad you brought this up. And this is essentially where corporations will, put a yoga room in the office and call that their new mental health initiative, or maybe they provide you with a free subscription to a mindfulness app, things like that, while the actual working conditions are still high stress, exploitative, people are still burnt out.
I do see a lot of that. I have worked for some big organizations in recent years, certainly before and after the pandemic, and corporate wellness is definitely a thing. And I think the more cynical employees in the workforce would say that's being laid on to try and help us, feel better so they can get more out of us. We can still work long hours. We can deal with the stress that we're under in terms of what our deliverables are. And certainly post-COVID, HR in particular had to do a lot to support people's well-being and the move to working remotely and the isolation and everything that was caused by that. But in some cases, I think companies are thinking this is a cheaper alternative to actually addressing the workload issues, or paying people more so they've got more money in their pockets to be able to choose how they look after their well-being and their health and fitness.
And then you can also think about the whole wellness to pseudoscience pipeline, which I think is something that both of our generations have seen, although maybe in different forms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for Gen X, things like homeopathy, detox diets, the idea you could cleanse your liver with a juice fast. A lot of that was harmless, but scientifically, like nothing to back it up. Some of it was nonsense. Actively harming people. You could get into the whole anti-vax stuff. For example, there's some serious consequences if people follow some of the advice that's at the more extreme end of what's out there.
Yeah, and for Gen Z, a lot of stuff I've seen recently is like this whole gut health thing, people freaking out about seed oils and people online on TikTok shop or whatever selling supplements that they honestly have no idea what is actually in them or what they're selling or what they're selling, telling their followers to sack all these, 8 different pills and you'll feel so much better. And I think COVID made that worse because all of a sudden people were genuinely terrified. And the official messaging that we were getting was slow or inconsistent. And then all the wellness grifters online definitely got into that space and exploited people's fears and vulnerabilities. I think the boost your immunity industry during COVID was crazy. All these products making claims about COVID prevention that had no evidence, and then these were sold to people who were scared and had limited access to accurate information. Even I think there's like a anti-parasitic drug that people were buying in massive stocks because they were, they read online that was going to help stop them getting COVID. So it was all a bit nuts.
Yeah, it was. And it's crazy to think that was 6 years ago, the start of the pandemic. I think with hindsight, it revealed the way we were all living, regardless of which generation you're in. It just wasn't sustainable. It was a massive global reset. Yeah. And even
it's like you when you'd got to that point in 2020 where you realise I'm absolutely shattered.
Exhausted. Yeah, but don't think I was fully burnt out, but I was certainly on the way. So in a way, it prevented that burnout rates, mental health crisis, the cracks in the mental health system, the cracks in the healthcare system. It was at breaking point because of the strains placed upon it from COVID. And we were all kind of disconnected from community, from family. COVID exacerbated and exposed those pre-existing issues. And I think we are still recovering from that.
I think we've spoken about this before on some other kind of health-related episodes, but pre-pandemic, there's definitely been this glorification of busyness and always having something on the go and having a project on all the time and having all these hobbies and all the rest of it. And the lockdowns, for all their horror and all of the trauma and horrible stuff that we all endured, it did really force a lot of people to stop and ask themselves, is this actually how I want to live? Like, what have I been doing with my life up until this point? What's going on with my health? And I think that's where the wellness craze has kind of come from, because in its most genuine form, it was a real collective awakening for everyone. We had to literally stop and pause what we were doing.
Yeah, and I think for both Gen Z and Gen X, the two generations have something to offer in terms of their differing approaches. Openness and self-awareness of Gen Z is a really good thing. I think it's advanced the discussion around mental health generally. Even some Gen Xers will open up to those kind of conversations now, which previously never would have happened. And the pragmatism and some of the skepticism of Gen X in terms of like, this can't be right, and if it looks too good to be true, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, to be skeptical about this, that's also good. So we're probably moving closer to what a genuinely healthy relationship with wellness looks like, but it does seem like very, very commercialized at the moment. The willingness to ask for help, but pair it with, does this actually work, is a really sensible approach to take. But also, like, how am I getting on with my life, rather than making wellness itself a full-time project or an obsession, or thinking some of those quick fixes will deal with the underlying issues that you might be experiencing.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things COVID has highlighted has been community, because one of the most consistent findings from all the post-COVID research, again, like what we spoke about in our Third Spaces episode, I think, is that social connections are one of the biggest predictors of well-being. And I think all the apps and supplements and all the workouts and all the things you can subscribe to and buy are probably just a nice add-on to that, if they're well researched. But if you have a genuine community around you and people looking out for you, that can do a lot more for you than for your well-being than almost anything that you can buy. During the pandemic, that was, obviously completely wrecked. And then I think the wellness obsession has partly been an attempt to fill that gap while trying to take control back and prepare for if we ever get ourselves in a situation like that again. God forbid, people want to feel like they're more, ready for the next big health issue, which hopefully isn't going to happen anytime soon because we're all at the end of our tether.
But you're absolutely right about community. And I think we might have mentioned this before. The biggest finding from the longest running study on adult development identified that the greatest risk to someone's health is loneliness.
Yeah.
And people experiencing loneliness, they identified the impact that had on their health was the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
So,
That's
drugs,
crazy.
alcohol, cigarettes all play a role, but not having strong relationships round about you is absolutely fundamental to being healthy. And it was a big reset. So we need to kind of get back to that.
That's kind of another reason why it's so important to not get so wrapped into the toxicity of wellness culture online as well, because in a weird way, that is very isolating. And I think being so focused on what other people are doing with their lives and that comparison trap of, oh, I don't have, the most glowy skin ever. I need to take this supplement. I don't have washboard abs. I need to get myself into the gym. Getting into that kind of self-analysis and self-focus that I was talking about earlier on, that is really isolating. So is actually potentially having the opposite effect of what we want.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is the kind of enduring theme across all of this is that as human beings, we're inherently lazy. We will rather take a quick fix than actually do the work. Because even when I was growing up, there were ads in the Sunday supplements of like electrical things you could stick on your stomach, and all of a sudden you'd have a 6-pack and all sorts of other.
Those are still going around online.
I know. All sorts of gimmicks that would promise you the perfect body, but actually there's some basic physics around how to get in good shape, but we would all rather take the shortcut than do the work. I think what this has created is more awareness about generally what good health is like. And it's given people some more options, but the commercial element doesn't work for everyone. I think as a society, we need to think about how can we help people be healthier, because there's a massive benefit there in terms of preventative medicine, which means there's less demand on the health service to fix things when things do go wrong. If people have got really chronic, long-running health issues that they could have fixed if they just looked after themselves a bit better. So, you're absolutely right that things have dramatically moved on, and COVID probably was a catalyst. But by and large, I think we're heading in the right direction, but you just need to take everything with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. I need to swing the pendulum the other way now from what we've seen online with all the Ozempic and all the madness. But we are getting there. I think the conversation is happening. So to wrap up, I would love to know one thing that you've taken away from this conversation, or one thing that you've learned.
I think the thing that has stood out for me is that this affects all of us. We have different approaches. As I'm getting older, I'm thinking more about my health in terms of heading into old age. And my sense for your generation is there is a bit more focus on maintaining your health in the midst of all of these cultural, social, political forces. The world is a crazy place right now, and you're thinking, how am I going to get through the next 70, 80 years? Because you could well live to 100, but you've got to deal with all of this stuff that's going on. So, I think we do have more options and we have more information, but we need to apply it sensibly.
Yeah. I think for me, it's been good to be reminded that stripping it back to basics is good. Like you mentioned, it's good to have options for how we can promote health and well-being. Like, me, I love taking different kinds of classes and things to get my exercise. But sometimes having that all or nothing mindset of I either need to be doing a class every single day and taking 8 different vitamins at a time and having this smoothie and this, protein powder, whatever, that can be really unhelpful. The flip side of that is, why don't I just focus on getting some steps in today and getting a good night's rest and not being so obsessed with doing the absolute most all the time, or also giving all these corporations my money when I could just go outside and touch some grass. Absolutely. So that's been good to go over.
Good. For our next episode, we are building on this theme by looking at longevity. So Gen X are maybe a bit more focused on what old age is going to be like, as we see some of the things that our parents are going through. and Gen Z a bit more focused on dealing with everything that's going on in the world and some of the longer term health implications of some of the trends we're seeing at the moment. So we will dig into that next time round.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating and leave a review with your thoughts. We love to hear them. And thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Gen XZ Exchange.